John Carter was not an ordinary man. He had spent more than 20 years serving his country as a highly respected military advisor. His life revolved around duty, honor, and protecting others. From advising top leaders to training soldiers on the battlefield, John had seen it all. But nothing in his long career could have prepared him for what would happen during a routine flight from Washington, D.C. to Atlanta. It was a typical day when John arrived at the airport. He carried only a small backpack with some documents, his phone, and a book he planned to read during the journey. Dressed casually in jeans and a simple polo shirt, John looked like any other traveler. However, there was something about him that always made people notice: his presence. Standing tall at 6 feet with dark skin and short-cropped hair, he exuded confidence and authority. Yet this same appearance often led to awkward moments, ones where people judged him unfairly because of how he looked. As John waited to board the plane, his phone buzzed. It was an unexpected call from a colleague back in Washington. They wanted to discuss a potential security threat related to Europe, a matter that required immediate attention. Though these calls were part of his job, John couldn't shake off the feeling that this one felt different somehow. Still, he answered professionally, taking notes while keeping his voice low so as not to disturb those around him. After finishing the conversation, John boarded the plane and settled into his assigned seat near the middle of the cabin. The seat next to him remained empty until just moments before takeoff. A man wearing aviator sunglasses and a baseball cap slid into the space beside him. Without saying a word, the man glanced briefly at John before turning away. Something about the stranger's behavior caught John's eye. He seemed restless, constantly adjusting his cap and shifting in his seat. At first, John thought maybe the man was nervous about flying or perhaps dealing with personal stress. Whatever it was, John decided it wasn't worth worrying about. The plane taxied down the runway and lifted smoothly into the sky. Passengers relaxed, flipping through magazines or scrolling on their phones. Some closed their eyes, hoping to catch a nap. Everything appeared normal. Then, without warning, a flight attendant approached John. Her face was tense, her lips pressed tightly together as if she were holding back words too heavy to say aloud. "Sir, I need you to come with me," she whispered urgently, leaning close enough for only John to hear. Startled, John turned to look at her. "What's going on?" he asked, his tone calm but curious. Instead of answering, the flight attendant simply repeated herself. "Please follow me." Confused, John unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. As he moved past the rows of passengers, he noticed heads turning to watch him. Whispers began spreading throughout the cabin like wildfire. People whispered to each other, pointing discreetly in his direction. Some pulled out their phones to record videos, capturing every moment of the unfolding scene. John tried to stay composed, telling himself it might be a misunderstanding. Maybe someone needed help, or perhaps there was a minor issue unrelated to him. But deep inside, he couldn't ignore the sinking feeling growing in his chest. Something was wrong. Very wrong. When John reached the front of the plane, 2 uniformed police officers stood waiting. Their expressions were stern, their hands resting close to their holsters. One of them stepped forward, addressing John directly. "Sir, we've received reports that there may be a threat on board," the officer said, his voice firm but clipped. John blinked, taken aback by the accusation. "A threat? What kind of threat?" he asked, struggling to keep his tone steady. The second officer chimed in, his gaze fixed on John. "You match the description of someone flagged by Homeland Security earlier today." Flagged? John's mind raced. He hadn't done anything suspicious. All he'd done was answer a work-related call and sit quietly on the plane. This had to be a mistake. Surely they'd realize that once he explained himself. "What description are you talking about?" John pressed, trying to make sense of the situation. One of the officers hesitated before replying. "Male, African American, approximately 6 feet tall, wearing casual clothing." That was it. No specific details, no evidence tying him to any wrongdoing. Just vague traits that described countless men across the country. John felt anger bubbling beneath the surface, but he forced himself to remain calm. Losing his temper wouldn't solve anything. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his ID badge, which clearly identified him as a national military advisor. Holding it up for the officers to see, he asked, "Does this look like the kind of person who poses a threat?" The officers exchanged glances but didn't soften their stance. If anything, they seemed even more suspicious. One of them muttered, under his breath, "We're just following protocol." Protocol? John thought bitterly. Was this really protocol? Or was it prejudice disguised as safety? As the confrontation continued, tension filled the air. Passengers craned their necks to get a better view, whispering among themselves. Some stared openly, their faces reflecting fear or suspicion. Others avoided looking at John altogether, pretending to focus on their books or phones. Meanwhile, the man seated next to John, the one in the baseball cap, leaned forward slightly, watching the scene unfold with keen interest. Despite showing his credentials and explaining his role in national security, John realized the officers weren't convinced. They insisted he step off the plane immediately upon landing. For the first time in years, John felt powerless. Here he was, a decorated veteran who had dedicated his life to protecting his country, yet he was being treated like a criminal based solely on the color of his skin. It was infuriating and humiliating. As the plane soared higher into the sky, John sat back down, his mind racing with questions. Why was this happening? Who had reported him? And most importantly, how could he prove his innocence when the system itself seemed stacked against him? Little did he know, this was only the beginning of a harrowing ordeal that would test his strength, resilience, and faith in humanity. The tension on the plane was palpable. John Carter sat rigid in his seat, his mind racing as he tried to process what had just happened. Two police officers stood near him, their presence looming large over the cramped cabin. Passengers whispered, nervously, some glancing at John with suspicion while others avoided eye contact altogether. The man in the baseball cap who had been seated next to him leaned forward slightly, his body language tense, as though waiting for something explosive to happen. Despite showing his ID badge and explaining his role as a national military advisor, the officers remained unmoved. Their expressions were hard, almost robotic, as if they were following a script written by someone else. One of them repeated sternly, "Sir, we're asking you to cooperate. Step off the plane once we land." John clenched his jaw, trying to suppress the frustration bubbling inside him. He knew arguing wouldn't help, not here, not now, but staying silent felt unbearable. For years he had served his country with pride, risking his life to protect people like these passengers. And yet, here he was, being treated as a potential criminal simply because of how he looked. It was infuriating. "Can you at least tell me who reported me?" John asked, keeping his voice steady despite the storm brewing within him. The officers exchanged a glance but didn't answer. Instead, one of them muttered under his breath, "We're following orders." Orders? John thought bitterly. Whose orders? Who decided that vague descriptions could justify treating someone this way? He glanced around the cabin again, searching for any sign of empathy or understanding among the passengers. Most of them avoided meeting his gaze, but a few stared openly, their eyes reflecting fear, or maybe curiosity. Just then, the man in the baseball cap cleared his throat loudly. Everyone turned to look at him, including John. The stranger adjusted his sunglasses before speaking up. "I saw him acting suspiciously," he declared, pointing directly at John. The words hit like a punch to the gut. Suspiciously? What exactly did that mean? John's heart sank as murmurs rippled through the cabin. Passengers began whispering even more fervently, their voices hushed but urgent. Some nodded along with the man's statement, while others looked unsure. John locked eyes with the man in the baseball cap, his disbelief turning into anger. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice rising slightly. "I haven't done anything." The man shrugged, feigning nonchalance. "You were talking on the phone before takeoff. You sounded intense." Intense? John couldn't believe what he was hearing. Yes, he'd taken a call, but it was work-related, a routine discussion about security matters. How could anyone twist that into something sinister? Before John could respond, one of the officers stepped closer, his hand hovering near his holster. "Enough," he barked. "Lower your voice and sit down." The command came out sharp and authoritative, leaving no room for argument. But John refused to back down. Not entirely, anyway. "This is ridiculous," he said firmly, addressing both the officers and the passengers. "I'm a decorated military advisor. I've spent my entire career serving this country. Are you really going to accuse me of being a threat based on nothing but hearsay?" His words hung in the air, heavy and charged. For a moment there was silence. Then the whispers started again, louder this time. Some passengers seemed sympathetic, nodding quietly as if agreeing with John. Others, however, continued to cast wary glances in his direction. The officers, clearly growing impatient, tightened their grips on their weapons. One of them leaned in closer, his tone dripping with warning. "Sir, I won't ask again. Sit down, or we'll use force." Force? John's stomach churned at the thought. Would they actually draw their guns on him, in front of all these witnesses, just because he dared to question their authority? It seemed absurd, almost surreal. Yet as he looked into the officer's cold, unyielding eyes, he realized they might do exactly that. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. John locked eyes with the officers, silently daring them to make a move. He wasn't afraid of them. He'd faced far worse dangers in his line of work. But he also knew that resisting would only escalate the situation and possibly put innocent lives at risk. Reluctantly, he sat back down, his fists clenched tightly in his lap. As the confrontation simmered down, the atmosphere on the plane remained tense. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some pretending to focus on their phones or books while others continued to steal glances at John. The flight attendants moved cautiously through the aisles, offering drinks and snacks but avoiding the area where the officers stood guard. Meanwhile, the man in the baseball cap leaned back, in his seat, a smug expression on his face. John couldn't shake the feeling that this whole ordeal was orchestrated, a deliberate attempt to humiliate him. Was this man prejudiced against him because of his race? Or was he simply looking for attention, eager to play the hero in front of everyone else? Whatever the motive, one thing was clear. John wasn't going to let this slide. He vowed to prove his innocence no matter what it took. As the plane continued its journey toward Atlanta, John stared out the window, watching the clouds drift by. His mind was filled with questions, doubts, and simmering anger. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every person who had ever been judged unfairly because of the color of their skin. Building anticipation. Though outwardly calm, John's thoughts churned like a stormy sea. He replayed the events leading up to this moment, searching for clues that might explain why this was happening. Had someone tipped off the authorities beforehand? If so, who? And why? The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. This wasn't justice. It was profiling, plain and simple. Passengers nearby began discussing the situation in hushed tones. A young woman seated across the aisle whispered to her companion, "Do you think he's really dangerous?" Her friend shrugged uncertainly. "I don't know. But if the police are involved..." John caught snippets of their conversation and felt a pang of sadness. These were ordinary people, scared and confused, willing to believe the worst without knowing the truth. It was a sobering reminder of how easily fear could cloud judgment and turn reasonable individuals into accomplices to injustice. Despite the mounting pressure, John resolved to stay composed. Losing his temper wouldn't solve anything. It would only reinforce stereotypes and give his accusers ammunition to use against him. Instead, he focused on finding a way to clear his name once they landed. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to fight back. Not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever faced similar discrimination. As the plane descended toward Atlanta, John braced himself for what lay ahead. Cameras would flash, reporters would swarm, and accusations would fly. But none of that mattered. What mattered was proving that he was innocent and exposing the flaws in a system that allowed such injustices to occur in the first place. When the wheels touched down on the runway, John took a deep breath. The hardest part was yet to come. The plane touched down at Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, jolting slightly as the wheels met the runway. Passengers clapped politely, a habit ingrained from years of air travel, but the mood on board remained tense. Carter sat stiffly in his seat, his jaw clenched and his hands gripping the armrests. He knew what was coming next, his forced removal from the plane under the watchful eyes of police officers who still hadn't provided any concrete evidence against him. As the aircraft taxied to its gate, whispers buzzed throughout the cabin like an invisible current. Some passengers openly stared at John, while others pretended not to notice, burying their faces in magazines or scrolling aimlessly on their phones. The man in the baseball cap leaned back in his seat, a satisfied smirk playing on his lips. His earlier accusation that John had acted suspiciously seemed to have planted seeds of doubt in the minds of many. Yet even among those who believed him guilty, there were murmurs of unease. Was this really how justice worked? Could vague descriptions and hearsay justify treating someone this way? When the seatbelt sign finally switched off, the two police officers approached John again. One of them gestured sharply toward the aisle. "Sir, please exit the plane now." His tone left no room for negotiation. John stood slowly, his movements deliberate. He glanced around the cabin one last time, searching for allies or at least understanding, but most passengers avoided his gaze. Only a few met his eyes, offering sympathetic nods or faint smiles. Among them was a young woman seated near the window. She mouthed something silently, her lips forming the words, "I'm sorry." It wasn't much, but it gave John a small spark of hope. Not everyone had turned against him. As he made his way down the narrow aisle, cameras clicked and phones were raised high, capturing every step of his humiliation. Passengers craned their necks to get a better view, some filming discreetly while others didn't bother hiding their curiosity. Outside the plane, a crowd had already gathered, alerted by social media posts about the potential threat on board. Reporters shoved microphones toward John, shouting questions that blurred together in a chaotic din. "Are you armed? Did you pose a threat to the flight? What is your response to the allegations?" John ignored them all, focusing instead on maintaining his composure. He walked alongside the officers, his head held high despite the weight of judgment, pressing down on him. Inside, though, anger simmered. How could this be happening? He had spent decades protecting people like these reporters, these passengers, these officers, and yet here he was, being treated as a criminal without cause. Once inside the terminal, John was led to a private holding area. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the sterile room. Two additional officers joined the group, their expressions equally grim. One of them pulled out handcuffs and snapping them onto John's wrists with a metallic click that echoed loudly in the confined space. "This is unnecessary," John said firmly, his voice steady despite the indignity of the situation. "I haven't done anything wrong?" The officer shrugged, unapologetic. "Procedure," he replied curtly. "Procedure?" John thought bitterly. This wasn't procedure. It was prejudice masquerading as protocol. He took a deep breath, reminding himself to stay calm. Losing control wouldn't help. It would only give his accusers more ammunition to use against him. Instead, he resolved to cooperate fully, knowing that proving his innocence was the only way out of this nightmare. For nearly an hour, John endured relentless questioning. The officers grilled him about his background, his recent activities, and the nature of his work. They asked for details about the phone call he'd taken before takeoff, scrutinizing every word he said. At times, they seemed skeptical of his answers, pressing him for clarification or cross-referencing his statements with unknown sources. John answered patiently, providing thorough explanations backed by facts. He even offered to contact his superiors for verification, but the officers dismissed the suggestion with a wave of their hands. Throughout the interrogation, John couldn't shake the feeling that this was less about finding the truth and more about intimidation. The officer's questions weren't designed to uncover evidence, they were meant to provoke, to rattle him into making a mistake. But John refused to give them that satisfaction. He remained composed, his responses measured and respectful, even when frustration threatened to boil over. Meanwhile, outside the holding area, public outrage was growing. News of the incident had spread rapidly across social media platforms, sparking heated debates about racial profiling and systemic injustice. Hashtags like Justice for John Carter and End Racial Profiling began trending nationwide, drawing attention to the broader issue of discrimination within law enforcement and transportation security. Supporters rallied outside the airport, holding signs that read, "Stop criminalizing black men" and "We stand with John." Among the protesters was Sarah Bennett, the young journalist who had been seated across the aisle from John during the flight. She had witnessed the entire ordeal firsthand and was determined to expose the truth. Armed with her press credentials and a fiery determination, Sarah gave live interviews to news outlets recounting what she had seen and heard. Her account painted a vivid picture of injustice, a decorated military advisor humiliated and detained based solely on baseless accusations and racial bias. Back inside the holding area, the officers finally admitted that there was no credible evidence linking John to any wrongdoing. Reluctantly, they removed the handcuffs and informed him that he was free to go. But the damage had already been done. For hours, John had been treated like a criminal, stripped of his dignity, and subjected to public scrutiny. As he walked out of the terminal, cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, but John kept moving, his expression unreadable. Outside, the crowd erupted into cheers and applause. Protesters chanted his name, holding up signs in solidarity. A few strangers approached him, offering hugs and words of encouragement. "Thank you for your service," one elderly man said, tears glistening in his eyes. "This shouldn't have happened to you." John nodded graciously, grateful for the support but overwhelmed by the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside him. Anger, sadness, pride, all collided in a storm of conflicting feelings. He had faced hatred head-on and emerged stronger than ever, but the scars of this experience would linger long after the headlines faded. As John climbed into a waiting car, he reflected on the day's events. What had started as a routine flight had spiraled into a national controversy, shining a spotlight on the very issues he had fought tirelessly to address throughout his career. Racial profiling, systemic bias, and unchecked authority, they were problems that needed solutions, not just sympathy. And though the road ahead would be challenging, John vowed to keep fighting for himself, for his community, and for future generations. The battle wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. The days following the incident were a blur of media appearances, public statements, and emotional exhaustion for John Carter. The story of his ordeal had exploded across every major news outlet, igniting fierce debates about racial profiling, systemic bias, and law enforcement accountability. While some people rallied behind him, praising his composure and resilience, others questioned his innocence, clinging to unfounded suspicions fueled by fear and misinformation. Amidst the chaos, John found himself caught between two worlds. One, filled with support and solidarity, and another rife with hostility and distrust. John's first major interview came just 2 days after the flight. Sitting across from a well-known journalist on national television, he recounted the events in detail, his voice steady, but tinged with frustration. "I've spent my entire career serving this country," he said, leaning forward slightly to emphasize his words. "I've risked my life to protect others, yet I was treated like a criminal based solely on how I look. That's not justice, that's prejudice." His statement resonated deeply with viewers, sparking an outpouring of sympathy and outrage. Social media lit up with messages of support, many sharing personal stories of similar experiences. People began using hashtags like #Stand with John and Justice for All to amplify their voices, demanding reforms in airport security protocols and law enforcement practices. Celebrities, activists, and politicians joined the conversation, calling for investigations into the incident and broader discussions about racial discrimination. But not everyone was convinced. Critics argued that the officers involved were simply doing their jobs, following procedures designed to keep passengers safe. Some commentators suggested that John's military credentials shouldn't exempt him from scrutiny, pointing out that threats could come from anyone, regardless of background. These arguments, though valid in theory, ignored the glaring issue at hand. There had been no credible evidence linking John to any wrongdoing. He had been targeted because of vague descriptions and racial stereotypes, a fact that couldn't be dismissed as mere coincidence. One of the most vocal advocates for John during this time was Sarah Bennett, the young journalist who had witnessed the confrontation firsthand. Determined to expose the truth, Sarah published a detailed expose titled "Profiling in Plain Sight: The Story of John Carter." In it, she described the events on the plane with unflinching clarity, highlighting moments that underscored the absurdity of the situation. She wrote about the man in the baseball cap fabricating accusations, the officers refusing to listen to reason, and the passengers torn between fear and fairness. Her article ended with a powerful call to action. "We cannot let this moment pass without demanding change. If we do, we fail not only John Carter but everyone who has ever been judged unfairly because of the color of their skin." Sarah's expose went viral, further amplifying John's story and galvanizing supporters nationwide. Protesters organized rallies outside airports, police stations, and government buildings, chanting slogans and holding signs that read, "End racial profiling now," and "Safety without discrimination." Lawyers specializing in civil rights cases reached out to John, offering pro bono representation if he decided to file a lawsuit against the airline and law enforcement agencies involved. Even members of Congress weighed in, introducing legislation aimed at addressing systemic bias within transportation security. Despite the growing momentum, John remained cautious. He knew that public opinion could shift quickly, especially when emotions ran high. What mattered most to him was ensuring that real, lasting change occurred, not just temporary fixes or performative gestures. To that end, he began working closely with advocacy groups focused on racial justice and police reform. Together, they drafted proposals for improved training programs, stricter guidelines for reporting suspicious behavior, and greater accountability for those enforcing security measures. John also made a conscious effort to engage directly with skeptics and critics. During interviews, he addressed their concerns head-on, acknowledging the importance of safety while emphasizing the need for balance. "Of course, we want our airports and planes to be secure," he said during one particularly heated exchange. "But security shouldn't come at the cost of dignity and respect. We can, and must, find ways to protect everyone without singling out individuals based on race or appearance." His willingness to listen and respond thoughtfully earned him respect even among those initially skeptical of his claims. One conservative talk show host admitted on air, "I didn't think much of this story at first, but hearing John speak has changed my perspective. Maybe we do have a problem here, and maybe it's time we fixed it." As the weeks passed, John became a symbol of resilience and hope for countless people. His calm demeanor and unwavering commitment to justice inspired others to share their own stories of discrimination, creating a ripple effect that extended far beyond the original incident. Schools invited him to speak to students about leadership and perseverance, while community organizations hosted forums where he discussed strategies for combating systemic racism. Yet, despite the progress being made, John couldn't ignore the toll the ordeal had taken on him personally. Sleepless nights plagued him, haunted by memories of the hostile stares, whispered accusations, and cold indifference of the officers who had detained him. There were moments when doubt crept in, whispering cruel questions. Would things ever truly change? Or would history continue to repeat itself no matter how hard people fought against it? On one such restless night, John sat alone in his living room, staring at a framed photograph on the wall. It showed him standing alongside fellow soldiers during his early days in the military, their faces glowing with pride and camaraderie. He remembered the sense of purpose he'd felt back then, the belief that his work mattered, that he was making a difference. Slowly, a small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. Perhaps this new chapter in his life was simply an extension of that mission. After all, fighting injustice wasn't so different from defending freedom. It required courage, determination, and an unshakable faith in the possibility of a better future. The next morning, John woke up refreshed and ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. He dressed carefully, choosing a suit that conveyed professionalism and strength. As he stepped outside, sunlight streaming through the trees, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The battle for equality and justice was far from over, but he was determined to see it through, to honor not only his own experience, but the countless others whose voices had long gone unheard. And so, with each step forward, John carried not just his own story, but the hopes and dreams of an entire movement. For every person who had ever been judged unfairly, for every child who deserved a world free from prejudice, he vowed to keep fighting. Because sometimes, the hardest battles are the ones worth waging, and John Carter was ready to win. The days following the incident were a whirlwind of emotions for John Carter. Despite being released without charges, the weight of what had happened lingered heavily on his shoulders. He was free, yes, but the scars of humiliation ran deep. The stares, the whispers, the cameras flashing in his face, it all felt like a second layer of punishment, one that no amount of apologies or public outrage could erase. John returned to his home late one evening after weeks of media appearances, protests, and meetings with advocacy groups. Exhaustion clung to him like a shadow, tugging at his resolve. As he walked through the door, he dropped his keys onto the kitchen counter and slumped into a chair. The house was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to sit still, to breathe, to think, to feel everything he'd been pushing aside. His mind replayed the events over and over again, the suspicious glances from passengers, the cold indifference of the officers, the smug expression of the man in the baseball cap who had accused him of acting suspiciously. Each memory stung, reopening wounds he thought would heal faster, but they didn't. Instead, they festered, gnawing at his sense of dignity and self-worth. What hurt most wasn't just the incident itself. It was the realization that this wasn't an isolated event. It was part of a larger pattern, a system that failed people like him far too often. John had always known about racial profiling, but experiencing it firsthand made it painfully real. He understood now why so many others had spoken out before him, why protests erupted in streets across the country, why hashtags trended on social media. This wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had ever been judged unfairly because of their race, gender, religion, or appearance. Yet amidst the anger and frustration, there was also gratitude. Gratitude for the strangers who had stood up for him on the plane, like Sarah Bennett, whose voice had pierced through the tension. Gratitude for the protesters chanting his name outside the airport, holding signs that read, "We believe you," and "No justice, no peace." And gratitude for the countless messages of support flooding his inbox, each one reminding him that he wasn't alone. Still, the road ahead was daunting. While public opinion seemed to favor him, John knew that changing deeply ingrained biases wouldn't happen overnight. People might cheer today, but tomorrow they could forget, or worse, revert to old habits when faced with uncomfortable truths. Real change required more than sympathy or fleeting outrage. It demanded action, accountability, and persistence. Determined to channel his pain into purpose, John threw himself into advocacy work. He partnered with civil rights organizations to draft policy proposals aimed at reforming airport security, protocols, and law enforcement training programs. These proposals included measures such as mandatory anti-bias workshops for officers, clearer guidelines for identifying credible threats, and independent oversight committees to investigate misconduct allegations. John insisted that these changes be rooted in data and evidence rather than assumptions or stereotypes. He also began speaking at conferences, schools, and community events, sharing his story with anyone willing to listen. His talks weren't just about the flight or the injustice he endured. They were about resilience, empathy, and the power of collective action. "This isn't my fight alone," he often said during speeches. "It's ours. If we want a world where everyone feels safe and respected, we have to build it together. One particularly memorable event took place at a high school auditorium packed with students eager to hear from him. As John stepped onto the stage, the room erupted into applause. Teenagers held up homemade signs that read, "You're our hero," and "Keep fighting." Their enthusiasm brought tears to his eyes. For a moment he stood silently, letting the wave of support wash over him. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a mix of strength and vulnerability. "I'm not here to tell you I'm perfect," he began, his tone soft but firm. "I make mistakes just like anyone else. But what happened to me wasn't about perfection, it was about fairness. About treating people as human beings, not labels or statistics." He went on to share details of the incident, describing how it felt to be handcuffed and interrogated despite having done nothing wrong. Some students gasped audibly while others scribbled notes furiously in their notebooks. When he finished, a young girl raised her hand tentatively. "Mr. Carter," she asked, her voice trembling, "how do you keep going when people treat you badly?" John smiled gently, leaning closer to the microphone. "That's a great question," he replied. "The truth is, I don't always know how to keep going. Sometimes I feel angry or sad or tired, but then I remember something important. I'm not fighting for myself alone. I'm fighting for my family, my friends, my community, and for future generations. That gives me strength." By the end of the talk, the audience was on its feet, cheering wildly. Many students approached him afterward, asking for advice on how to stand up against discrimination in their own lives. John listened patiently, offering encouragement and practical tips. "Start small," he told them. "Speak up when you see injustice, even if it's scary. Educate yourself and others, and never underestimate the power of your voice." As the weeks turned into months, John's efforts began yielding results. Airlines implemented new policies requiring officers to provide specific evidence before detaining passengers flagged as potential threats. Lawmakers introduced legislation aimed at addressing systemic bias within transportation security. Even, the airline involved in the incident issued a formal apology, pledging to improve staff training and customer relations. But progress came with setbacks. Critics dismissed John's advocacy as divisive, accusing him of playing the victim card. Online trolls attacked him mercilessly, posting hateful comments beneath articles and videos featuring his story. At times, the negativity threatened to overwhelm him. Yet John refused to let it silence him. He responded to criticism with grace, inviting detractors to engage in constructive dialogue rather than resorting to insults or accusations. One evening, as John scrolled through social media, he stumbled upon a comment that caught his attention. It read, "I used to think racial profiling was exaggerated until I heard John Carter's story. Now I understand why people are angry. Thank you for opening my eyes." The message was simple, yet profound. It reminded John that change often started with small shifts in perspective, moments when someone paused long enough to consider another point of view. Inspired by the comment, John decided to launch a podcast titled Unheard Voices, dedicated to amplifying stories of marginalized individuals. Each episode featured interviews with people who had experienced discrimination firsthand: teachers, doctors, artists, and everyday citizens whose lives had been shaped by prejudice. Through their narratives, John hoped to foster greater understanding and empathy among listeners. The podcast quickly gained traction, drawing praise from critics and fans alike. Listeners praised John for creating a platform that prioritized authenticity and healing over blame or resentment. One reviewer wrote, "This isn't just storytelling, it's bridge building. Every episode reminds us of our shared humanity." Despite the growing success of his advocacy work, John remained grounded. He never sought fame or recognition. His goal was simply to create a better world, one where no one had to endure what he had gone through. On quiet nights, he would sit by the window, gazing at the stars and reflecting on how far he'd come. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had taught him invaluable lessons about courage, compassion, and the enduring power of hope. And though challenges still lay ahead, John knew he wasn't walking this path alone. Behind him stood millions of supporters, people who believed in justice, equality, and the possibility of change. Together, they formed a movement, united by a common vision of a brighter, fairer future. For John Carter, the battle wasn't over, but neither was his spirit. Months had passed since the incident on the plane, but its impact continued to ripple through John Carter's life and society at large. What began as a single act of injustice had grown into a national movement, sparking conversations about racial profiling, systemic bias, and the urgent need for reform. For John, this transformation was both inspiring and humbling. He had started out as an ordinary man trying to clear his name, but now he found himself at the forefront of a fight that transcended personal grievances. The changes brought about by John's advocacy were undeniable. Airlines revised their security protocols, requiring officers to justify any suspicion with concrete evidence rather than vague descriptions. Lawmakers introduced legislation aimed at holding law enforcement accountable for discriminatory practices. Schools added anti-bias training programs to their curricula, teaching students the importance of empathy and fairness from a young age. Even social media platforms played a role, amplifying marginalized voices and fostering dialogue about inequality. But while these accomplishments were significant, they didn't erase the underlying issues. Racial profiling wasn't just a problem in airports or police stations, it was embedded in institutions across the country. It manifested in schools, workplaces, healthcare systems, and neighborhoods. Dismantling it would take more than policy changes. It required a cultural shift, a collective decision to see people as individuals rather than stereotypes. John understood this better than anyone. As much as he appreciated the progress made so far, he knew there was still work to be done. So, he kept pushing forward, using every opportunity to educate, inspire, and challenge those around him. His podcast, Unheard Voices, became a cornerstone of his efforts, providing a platform for others to share their stories. Each episode highlighted different perspectives, shining a light on experiences often overlooked or dismissed. One particularly impactful episode featured a young woman named Maya, a college student who had been racially profiled during a routine traffic stop. Her voice trembled as she recounted the fear and anger she felt when officers pulled her over without cause, searched her car, and questioned her relentlessly, all because of her race. "I've never broken a law in my life," she said, tears streaming down her face. "But that day I realized how little my innocence mattered." Maya's story resonated deeply with listeners, many of whom reached out to express solidarity and support. Some shared similar experiences, while others admitted they hadn't fully understood the extent of racial profiling until hearing her speak. The episode went viral, prompting widespread discussions about policing and accountability. Local lawmakers even cited it as motivation for introducing new transparency measures within law enforcement agencies. Inspired by the response, John expanded the scope of his activism. He collaborated with artists, musicians, and filmmakers to create multimedia projects that explored themes of identity, justice, and resilience. One such project was a documentary titled Through Their Eyes, which followed several individuals navigating the challenges of living in a biased system. The film premiered at a prestigious festival, earning critical acclaim and sparking debates long after the credits rolled. Despite these successes, John faced moments of doubt. There were days when the weight of responsibility felt overwhelming, when the sheer scale of the problem seemed insurmountable. During one particularly difficult week, he received a letter from a listener who accused him of exploiting his experience for attention. The words stung, dredging up insecurities he thought he'd overcome. Was he doing enough? Could he ever truly make a difference? On nights like these, John turned to the people who had supported him from the beginning, his family, friends, and fellow advocates. They reminded him of the lives he had touched, the countless individuals who saw themselves in his story and found courage to speak up. Their encouragement reignited his determination, pushing him to keep going despite the obstacles. Then came a turning point. a moment that reaffirmed why John had chosen this path. It happened during a town hall meeting organized by a coalition of civil rights groups. Hundreds of people gathered in a packed auditorium, eager to discuss ways to combat discrimination in their community. When John took the stage, the room erupted into applause. People stood cheering loudly, their faces glowing with admiration and gratitude. As the noise subsided, John looked out at the crowd, overwhelmed by the sea of hopeful faces. "When I stepped onto that plane months ago," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I never imagined where this journey would lead. I didn't ask to become a symbol of resistance. I just wanted to prove my innocence. But along the way, I realized something important. Our struggles connect us. They remind us that we're not alone." He paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. "Change doesn't happen overnight. It takes time, effort, and patience. But if we stand together, if we refuse to stay silent, we can build a world where everyone feels safe, valued, and respected. That's the legacy I want to leave behind." The audience erupted again, this time chanting his name. Strangers embraced, vowing to carry the torch of activism beyond the walls of the auditorium. In that moment, John felt a profound sense of fulfillment. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the collective power of humanity to rise above hatred and division. In the months that followed, John continued to advocate tirelessly, traveling across the country to speak at rallies, conferences, and community events. He worked closely with lawmakers to draft comprehensive reform bills, ensuring they addressed not only symptoms but root causes of systemic bias. He mentored young activists, equipping them with tools to amplify their voices and affect change. By year's end, John's influence had reached global proportions. International organizations invited him to share insights at forums focused on human rights and equality. His story appeared in textbooks, documentaries, and museum exhibits, serving as a testament to the enduring fight against injustice. Yet through it all, John remained humble, always redirecting praise to the communities fighting alongside him. Reflecting on the journey, John often thought about the passengers on that fateful flight, the ones who had judged him unfairly, the few who had stood up for him, and the many who had simply watched in silence. Each of them represented a piece of the puzzle, contributing to the broader picture of societal attitudes, and while some pieces were jagged and painful, others fit together seamlessly, forming connections that strengthened the whole. John's ultimate goal wasn't perfection, it was progress. He knew that biases wouldn't disappear entirely, nor would discrimination vanish overnight. But he also believed in the possibility of growth, in the capacity for individuals and institutions to evolve. As long as there were people willing to listen, learn, and act, hope remained alive. On New Year's Eve, surrounded by loved ones, John raised a glass to toast the future. "To change," he said, his eyes twinkling with resolve. "Not just for me, but for everyone." Cheers echoed around the room, a symphony of optimism and determination. For John Carter, the battle wasn't over, but neither was his spirit. He had faced hatred head-on and emerged stronger than ever, driven by a vision of a world where equality wasn't an aspiration, it was a reality. And though scars remained, both visible and invisible, John knew one thing for certain: he would never stop fighting for a better tomorrow.